My name is Nick. I'm a professor at Salem State University in the Department of Geography and Sustainability. And I'm going to be talking today about my dissertation, Reframing the Urban Forest. I was really excited to get invited to talk to you about this, both because urban forestry is having a moment. We're going to be talking about some legislation that is up this year in Massachusetts, but also because after you finish your dissertation, everyone tells you no one will read it or see it, and it just kind of goes off into the ether. And I got an email a few weeks later from someone who had looked at it. So I was really happy about that, and so thrilled to be here. So I'm going to be talking about a lot about urban forestry and different ways to look at urban forestry. And one of those ways is the image that we see here, which is an aerial image that I took of Salem State's campus. So these are two rows of American elms right in the center of campus. And they're definitely part of the centerpiece, and they create a lot of the feel and the student experience on campus. And so this will look both at understanding the distribution and layout of trees, specifically certain species, but also how they frame personal or individual experiences with those trees, and how the decisions that we make can ensure that these trees will continue to grow, be successful, and provide benefits for the Salem State community for years to come. So with that being said, I'm going to take you from Salem to Worcester. So I got my PhD at Clark University. A lot of my research started in urban forestry, started in Worcester. And I live in Worcester still, actually, to this day. Lots of love for the city of Worcester, the heart of the Commonwealth. And so here you can see a variety of images of Worcester. It's a post-industrial city with buildings like this train station here. It's also a city that is very heavily filled with impervious surface, very dense. And when I say impervious surface, I'm talking about buildings and roads. And the primary housing in Worcester is this triple decker, which you can see in the top with this, I think, pretty hilarious title, "What Happened to Worcester?" As if it had disappeared, something had happened to it. But these triple deckers are ubiquitous throughout Massachusetts. They're the primary housing stock that we have here. About almost a third to 40% of Worcester's population lives in a triple decker. And the first triple decker was actually built in Worcester, although Fall River does contest that. But the other thing I want to introduce to you about Worcester, and that I'm going to be talking about a lot, is that on the bottom right image, you can see here, this is a small business started by an immigrant family, and it is a city of immigrants. So Worcester is just over 20% first generation immigrants. So a lot of new Americans or citizens of other countries who do not necessarily speak English also live in Worcester and make up the community there. So that is one image of Worcester. Another image of Worcester is this. This is a street in Worcester on the west side, which is mostly single family homes. And you'll notice it's a very different feel to the images that I'd shown before. No triple deckers here. But for me, what sticks out the most are these huge trees lining the street. So you can see there's a complete canopy covering the entire street here, and all the benefits that come from these trees, shade, cooling, as well as privacy, and just the sense of safety as well that comes with a street like this. So the role of vegetation, it plays a huge role in the sense, the feeling of a neighborhood. So Worcester is a great example of somewhere that experiences the urban heat island. And here's the definition of an urban heat island. It's basically where the urban areas, the downtown areas, the places that I showed in this first image, are a lot hotter than the surrounding rural areas. And Worcester experiences all of that within its city. So there are rural areas like Broadmeadow Brook, which is a Mass Audubon site, and it's the largest urban conservation site in New England. But you can see a photo of what that looks like. And on the map, you can see it's very cool. Whereas in downtown Worcester, where that train station is, you can see the temperatures are much, much higher. And this range is 15, 20 degrees, especially on extremely hot days. So the urban heat island is we measure it in a variety of ways. This is all air temperature measurements. They were taken in 2019. You can see that in the morning, it's not very clear where is hot, where is not. It's generally everywhere is pretty cool. In the afternoon, it's almost the opposite. Everywhere is pretty warm. The landscape is heated up. But it's in the evening where we really see that certain areas are cooling down and other areas are staying warm. And that's often because of the land cover. So that's really where we see the impact of trees and vegetation in cooling the landscape. And so what I do a lot of is I'm looking at cities and Massachusetts through this lens of heat, but specifically I'm looking at the surface heat or the surface temperature. We measure this using satellite data, but you can see how this July 16th kind of composite of land surface temperatures mirrors very similarly that evening air temperature. So the land surface temperature really has a strong relationship with the evening temperature and often very strongly predicts what the air temperature will be in these two very different land covers. So that's the urban heat island effect. If we take a step back and think about, well, how is this going to change, or what's the impact of climate change in this scenario? I have this model that I show to my students where, if you were born in 2000, you might have about 5 days of extreme heat. And extreme heat is relative to the place or the climate that you live. For people in Florida, they might think 90 degrees Fahrenheit is not very hot. But for New England and for Massachusetts, 90 degrees is kind of our threshold for extreme heat. This is where we become concerned about the health effects or health risks of working outside or for students in schools. And so above 90 degrees is this important threshold. So if you were born in 2000, you experienced around 5 days of extreme heat on average. And maybe by 2080, you could be at an average of around 11 days of extreme heat with a maximum of 18 and a minimum of 5. So quite a large range depending on what happens with our climate models and what happens with our larger CO2 emissions, etc. But what I want to focus on is these numbers 5 and 18. That's kind of the range. And specifically 18 is perhaps the worst case scenario. So in 2021, me and a team of students actually took air temperature measurements. We really recorded what the temperature was in different parts of Worcester throughout the summer. And what we found was that the Worcester Airport, which is on the left of Worcester and the western side and the cooler side, surrounded by trees, up on a hill, had about 4 days of extreme heat. And that was very consistent with climate models. However, when we looked at downtown Worcester, we measured over 21 days of extreme heat. So the downtown of Worcester was actually experiencing the future climate beyond what any of our climate models predict for 80 years into the future. And that's really the impact of, that's where we see extreme heat and the urban heat island combined to really show that how dire the situation is and how kind of underappreciated it is. Because a lot of our climate models are predicting based on temperatures at airports. Boston's temperature is often based on Logan, which is right on the ocean and is definitely affected by that. So the urban cores of cities especially are not being properly taken into account in these climate models. And what we're seeing is that this has an impact in terms of who is actually experiencing these temperatures and who's going to be affected first. So Massachusetts has this term environmental justice that we use. It's now a legal classification after some legislation in 2020. But before it was just kind of like a policy classification. This is what the definition is now. You can see that it's based on household income, based on percent non-white or minority population, and also based on English language isolation. And if you map this on top of Worcester's urban heat island, I want you to focus specifically on the crosshatch boxes with the black outlines right in the middle of Worcester. Those are the hottest places in the city, and it's also the places where we see multiple EJ factors overlap. And so the distribution of heat is unequal, and also the distribution of our society is unequal. And this is one area that we're seeing these two things kind of combined. So I'm going to give a little bit of background about environmental justice in Massachusetts. We have a state that has legislation about this. So actually, the text from is I copied and pasted and put in there. But I'm pulling out 4 major points from the Massachusetts environmental justice definition. The first is to be protected from environmental hazards. And that's where this heat is very important, right? So during an extreme heat event or a prolonged heat wave, all people have the right to be protected from these hazards. Another is an access to clean environment and enjoy a clean environment. And that involves conservation of forests, the creation of parks, and making sure that we all have access to those. There's also an aspect of environmental justice that is related to being involved in the decision-making process. So having groups that have not only running a public forum, but also having an opportunity to affect the decision-making progress and make decisions specifically in the communities where they live. And then finally, the fourth aspect is really looking at the equitable distribution. So making sure that the harms and benefits are both, or the hazards and benefits, the burdens and benefits are equally shared or equitably shared across the state. And my dissertation really focused on this distribution. I'm a geographer and we make maps. So this is the part that really, speaks to the rest of the talk that I'm going to give. And I'm specifically also focusing on tree planting. So this is a young juvenile red maple that was planted in Fall River. And it's a good example of the type of trees that I'm going to be talking about throughout the rest of this talk. And this tree was planted by the Green the Gateway Cities program, which was the primary focus of my work. So my first chapter really was looking at how is heat distributed throughout Massachusetts, and specifically how is heat distributed in some of these gateway cities like Worcester, where the tree planting is going on, and the Green the Gateway Cities is working. So my data that I was using is from the Global Historical Climatology Network. It's a global network of weather stations. 57 of them are in Massachusetts. And in my study area, there were about 36 of these weather stations, as you can see here in this map on the left. I was restricted in the scope of this analysis because I really wanted to get satellite data during a heat wave. So I'm really interested in these extreme heat days. And so I was specifically looking at this section of Eastern Massachusetts. This includes, as you can see, about 4,000 of the 5,000 census blocks in Massachusetts. So the majority of the population lives here. It's about 80%. And if you are interested in the remote sensing side of it, there's some information about the satellite. Happy to talk more. I am a professor of remote sensing and happy to talk more about the Landsat program. Suffice to say, I'm very grateful for it. And what I was doing was I was taking land surface temperature. If you see this image of Leominster, this map of Leominster, and then converting it to air temperature and overlaying it with census blocks, census block groups. So I can able to see where there is the presence of extreme heat distributed throughout these cities. And this is a map of the total study area with census block groups. And what we found is that 85% of all the census block groups that are classified as one of the environmental justice indicators were experiencing extreme heat during this heat wave. So you can see what that looks like with this pie chart. You can also see the distribution of the extreme heat census block groups. Anything that's larger than like a very, very light red is above 90 degrees. The very dark red census block groups are over 100 degrees, according to our model, which would be extremely hot. And I should say this heat wave that we were particularly analyzing was, or the date of this is July 22nd, 2022. And it was the middle of a 6-day heat wave last summer. So and if you remember this, but I was actually in the field measuring trees and taking air temperature during that time. And it was really hard for me and my students. We had to take constant water breaks. One student suffered dehydration. It was very difficult to work in these urban areas. What we also see when we did this analysis is that when you have multiple environmental justice factors, so when there's a minority population that also classifies as median based on their income, and then also is isolated with English language, those are the hottest block groups. So the heat rises with the increase in the number of environmental justice factors, which is concerning. So the most vulnerable people are also experiencing the highest temperatures. We did see, though, that if we just think about the extreme heat areas, so just again looking at this map, 36% of those areas are also in non-EJ communities. So extreme heat is an issue that definitely has this environmental justice factor, but also there's a larger potential concern for non-EJ communities as well, especially in eastern Massachusetts, which is very, very heavily urbanized and developed. So what would be the solution to all this heat? The state of Massachusetts and a lot of people nationally are thinking trees. Trees have many benefits. The urban forest, the Nature Conservancy has this great graphic here. You can see, whether there's stress, mental health benefits, there's ecosystem benefits for biodiversity. There's multiple ecosystem services, from cooling the air to managing stormwater, filtering air quality. So there's a lot of potential benefits from trees. Here you can see an example of a tree being planted in Worcester this past summer, where the Green Gateway Cities is now working. But it's important to note that the tree in the Nature Conservancy diagram is much larger than the tree that is being planted. So it's incredibly important. The key factor is how do we get from this small tree to this much larger tree in order to actually receive many of these benefits. And then also it's important to note that the urban forest is also an unequal system. So if we look at Worcester again, and we have these two different images of Worcester and places in Worcester, we see that areas with environmental justice communities often are the areas without tree canopy and urban forest cover, whereas the areas with already a lot of existing tree canopy cover are also the areas that are already cooler, and that those are the wealthier neighborhoods. So urban forestry is working in this already inherently unequal space. And that's why this idea of environmental justice is incredibly important. The state of Massachusetts created the Green in the Gateway Cities program to address these inequalities in tree canopy cover. So they are targeting specifically environmental justice communities with the explicit purpose to increase tree canopy cover by about 5%, to reduce both the energy burden of these communities, but also the impacts of extreme heat and to decrease cooling. This work that I'm going to be showing you, the tree planting program started in 2014. Our surveys were done in 2018 and 2019. So these trees are about 3 to 4 years old, and that's at the end of what we would call the establishment phase. So trees are the most vulnerable in urban areas during the first 2 to 3 years post-planting. That would be the establishment phase, and it's where a tree is not fully adjusted to this situation yet, and it needs water, it needs resources provided by stewardship, provided by the local community or residents or the municipality. And here you can see where the cities on this map are that I looked at. They're kind of distributed evenly throughout the state. I do want to note that Fall River was one of the first cities they started planting in. So those were the oldest trees. Leominster, Chicopee, and Pittsfield are kind of later trees. They started planting in 2015 and 2016, respectively. It's important to note, just an update now, because this is now 4 years old, that the Green and Gateway Cities is now planted in every single one of these cities. So all the cities that are not green on this map have now become part of the program. So my first chapter really addressed where is the heat, what is the situation, what are the environmental harms. The second role wanted to understand how the trees are doing. And the unique thing about the Green in the Gateway Cities program is that it is a primary residential tree planting program. 80% of the trees they're planting are on private property, and the majority of them are on residential private property. This makes it really unique nationally. There's very few programs that are state-run, where the state does the planting, but they do it on private property. There's a lot of issues related to having access to the property and those sorts of things. So in order to have the state planting trees on private property, and specifically residential property, you really need to have strong community relationships. And that's one of the things that Green the Gateway Cities has done really well, is they're partnering with local nonprofits, and also the foresters are embedded in the communities for 3 or 4 years, sometimes more, really developing relationships with the individuals. And so I wanted to understand, there's been a lot of research in urban forestry around the urban foresters, how they approach things, the managers, municipal managers, but what is the role that residents, how do the residents see themselves partaking in this urban forestry program? Are they just passive recipients of these trees, or are they policy actors? And then I also want to understand, how do we get these two different outcomes related to these trees? So here we have a very healthy front yard tree, and then behind it, to the right of it, a very standing dead backyard tree, right? And so these two different outcomes lead to very different experiences for residents, and then eventually will lead to different outcomes in terms of the heat and the energy benefits that we'd expect from them. And so I'm looking at both, like, what are the factors that are most important, and then how can tree planting programs, enlist almost these volunteer residents as actors within their program to steward and care for these trees and also promote the program. So I'm looking at here these 4 different cities, and we looked at a network, basically the networks around the tree planting program in these cities. Here you can see each network is centered on the Department of Conservation and Recreation, which ran the program. And then there are relationships, both positive and negative, and or neutral with different stakeholders. You'll notice that if you look at Chicopee in particular, which I'm going to be talking about, it was almost a completely positive web of networks. We found, the foresters got along really well with the city, which got along really well with nonprofits. Everyone was very positive with each other. Whereas in other cities, it was very topsy-turvy. There would be unreliable actors. This was during the time in Fall River when there was like 4 different mayors in 3 years. Mayors were getting impeached left and right. The forestry department wasn't a stable partner in this program. So whereas in Pittsfield, you'll notice that actually the DCR was unstable, and they actually moved through 3 or 4 different foresters in the time they were working there. So there's lots of different variables that could impact the success of the program. We wanted to kind of capture the variability across cities. What's unique about this, and I think what will be true about the Municipal Forestry Act, is that it will look different in each municipality that it works in, and that's something to be aware of. We also looked at, for the residents, like why or how they decided to participate. You'll notice that I marked all the residents as unreliable, and that's because we saw a huge variety in the types of residents that were participating in this. What's great is that we saw almost every single resident was watering their trees. And if we look in a lot of urban forestry literature, watering the trees, especially during the establishment phase, is critical for tree survivorship and tree health. And the residents all sign a watering contract, a 2-year watering contract to receive a tree. They don't pay any money, but they do sign this contract. And it was great to see that residents were self-reporting, again, self-reporting. But they were self-reporting that they were watering the trees. They also were communicating quite frequently with the foresters and the DCRs. They would often phone the DCR forester that was in their city, and then they would see them out on the street and talk to them in person. So there's a lot of communication between the residents and the forestry program. In terms of why residents were receiving trees, we found that there was, again, a wide range of variety, but the majority of residents were really prioritizing aesthetics. So that was the primary ecosystem service that residents were receiving from the trees. In a lot of conversations with residents, they discussed enjoying the flowers of the trees, the fall colors. And it's no surprise that the residents who prioritize aesthetics also had the highest, or one of the highest, survivorship. Their trees were doing very, very, very well. And my personal theory is that if you're already kind of like maintaining your garden and watering your plants, the tree kind of fits into that landscape really nicely. What was interesting is that residents who prioritized the tree or wanted the tree for the reason of environment, which basically because they love nature or to make the environment better, those trees were doing substantially lower or lower survivorship, about 68% survivorship. So the more altruistic residents were also maybe more hands-off than residents who were prioritizing the tree for privacy or for a more material ecosystem service. That was an interesting finding. This was not a statistical. I want to be clear, because when we published this, we got a lot of pushback, and I said substantial, not statistical. It was not a statistical relationship, at least statistically significant, because the low end. So we just had too few number of interviews to really say if it's statistical or not. But just looking at it, there's clearly one is different than the other. And I think with a higher number of residents, we would have got to that statistical significance. We also want to understand how the residents understood the rules of the program, like how and why, what their role was within the program. And the negotiation part is really interesting. The residents were often reported that they would kind of push-pull with the DCR in terms of what species of trees were planted on their property. So residents talked about how they requested a flowering tree. The DCR would counter with a shade tree because they wanted increased canopy. And then they would agree to have like one flowering and one shade tree. So there was this process of engagement and negotiation. We also looked at how residents participated in the program beyond just taking the trees. And many of the residents, but not the majority, but many of them did advertise the program. They would tell their friends or tell their family about the program. And a lot of them would tell their neighbors about it. And that could be because the neighbors were asking them how they got these trees in their yard, or it could be that they, in conversations talked about how they just recently got trees in their yard. But we saw a large number of active participants, or a substantial number of active participants. So we tried to create typologies of residents. We have in the top left here, we classified residents as policy actors. Those are residents that negotiated, and they also participated in the program actively. And they're contrasted with these residents that we call passive recipients, which are residents that did not negotiate and didn't, so they just took whatever tree they were given. They also did not actively participate in any other way. And what we see here is that if residents either negotiated or if they participated in some other way, their trees did very, very, very well. If you look at their survivorship part of these boxes, policy actors had 95% survivorship, negotiators had 93% survivorship, communicators had 96% survivorship. But if we look at the passive recipients, it's down to 78% survivorship. So some sort of engagement beyond just receiving the tree seemed to also have knock-on effects in terms of both the amount they would reported watering and also the survivorship of their trees. So that is one chapter just looking at how residents view themselves. I think there's definitely, I'll get to kind of conclusions we can take away. After going through the second chapter, I really focus on Chicopee in particular. If you remember, Chicopee had the most positive, good vibes, all these very positive relationships between the DCR, the city, and nonprofit. So we zoomed in on Chicopee. Here's some background information about Chicopee, as well as a focus on the William-Nanset neighborhood, which is just along the Connecticut River on the other side from Holyoke. This neighborhood is a really interesting neighborhood. It was actually chosen because it's also undergoing a combined sewage overflow project, but it also is the red line part of Chicopee. So this is the neighborhood that, in looking at old HOLA maps in 1936, this was the part of Chicopee that banks were not allowed to loan to. So it's a fascinating part of the city to look at. And this aerial imagery kind of gives you a sense of what this part of Chicopee looks like. So it's a lot. There are both a combination of single family homes, but also a lot of triple deckers too, kind of next to each other. We looked at residential survivorship or residential trees and street tree and compare them with street trees. Street trees were being taken care of by state foresters, and the residential trees were getting taken care of by just, the residents, variety of residents for all their different motivations. But if you look at this top line that's highlighted, we see that there's no difference. The average survivorship for the resident trees is 93, and the average survivorship for the street trees is 95, and that is not significantly different. So the residents were taking care of their trees just as well as the state trained foresters, which is fantastic to see. And this is despite if you look down the next line, the drought, 50% of residents of the residential trees were or underwent the 2016 drought. And they are in buildings that are actually a lot older. So the buildings are significantly much more likely to be built older. So or actually younger buildings, which is also interesting. We'll get to that. This is an important variable. The street trees are mostly with buildings built before 1930. And 1930 is an interesting cutoff. It's when the last triple-decker was built. And so most buildings built before 1930 in Chicopee and in these gateway cities are all multifamily buildings. So they're like 2-family, 3-family buildings. They're not all like that, but especially in these areas that are very urbanized, that is what we saw typically. Whereas after 1930, legislation was passed to outlaw triple-deckers due to, at the time, anti-immigrant sentiment and also just anti-worker sentiment. And so we see many more single-family dominated homes. So when we looked at the factors, both in terms of what are the tree factors, what are the biophysical factors that might be important for tree survivorship, 2 factors jumped out of our analysis, and I'm not going to jump into too many of the models, but what's important here is that the non-shade trees were significantly doing a lot better, as well as the trees were planted in these buildings built before 1930. We're doing much better. And I'm going to get into that in the next few slides. So here's some examples of pre-1930, post-1930 building structure in Chicopee. This is from Google Streets. And you can see some of the trees that are planted in the images as well, both in very small front yards, or there'll be these kind of like very large areas of grass that might be like a building plot that no longer exists. But what I would like you to focus on for the pre-1930 urban structure is that there is always a street tree or a place for a street tree to be planted in those images. So residential property, trees on residential land were doing better, potentially because they're being planted with or next to these street trees. So the state foresters are coming by every day to take care of these street trees. The residents might potentially have been influenced by that. How much better are these trees doing? So the adjusted OR is the amount of times better. So we saw that these trees were 3.65 times more likely to be alive if they were planted in these buildings built before 1930. The post-1930 buildings, the single family, are interesting because they do not have these sidewalks with planting strips. So there was many fewer street trees planted in front of these buildings. There's also more fences. It's less of, everyone is less visible. Let's put it that way. And that makes sense. We like privacy. I live in a single family home. And one of the benefits is privacy. So there's less kind of observation of how your trees are doing as well, potentially. Urban structure is hard to analyze. It's been significant in this study and in other studies, but it's still something that as a field in urban forestry, we're trying to understand why this keeps coming up as being a significant factor in survivorship. The other variable is much less difficult to understand. So we found that non-shade trees, basically trees that are flowering or trees that were evergreens, were 4.7 times more likely to be alive than shade trees. And this makes sense because residents often prefer to have these flowering trees. They also prefer to have evergreens for privacy reasons. So they often plant them in lines to demark property boundaries, etc. And so we found that these trees were doing significantly better than the shade trees that the program was trying to plant. So our conclusions from this, how do we get back to these 2 trees here? We found that when residents are engaged with the program and beyond just receiving a tree, so if they are these policy actors, if they're negotiating, if they're communicating about the program, their trees are much more likely to be alive, and like the tree here on the left. Generally, residents do take very good care of their trees. Whether it's signing the contracts, whether it's seeing other trees planted in the neighborhood, but we found that residential tree survivorship was very high, both locally, but also compared to other national studies. It's definitely exceptional in that respect. The resident preferences for non-shade trees could be impacting how they're watering and how they're taking care of their trees. No resident told us. We asked them straight up, do you take care of your trees all the same or differently? And they take care of the trees exactly the same, but we are seeing differences in survivorship for non-shade trees. And then finally, there is an aspect of neighborhood structure, certain potential benefits of public tree planting, public tree maintenance that could be impacting residential tree survivorship. So why all of this matters? We're seeing that climate is warming in New England much faster than global averages. Here is a figure from a paper that was published at Salem State by Dr. Stephen Young that looks at climate from 1900 to 2020. New England is the orange line, whereas the global temperatures are the blue line. And so we're seeing that our temperatures here are rising much faster in the context of global climate change than perhaps many other places in the world. We're also seeing at the same time a decline in urban tree canopy cover. So despite the emphasis on urban forestry, and despite the attention by the state of Massachusetts and all the recent literature in urban forestry and the infrastructure bill by the federal government, we're seeing a tremendous decline in urban tree canopy cover. And that is exacerbating or increasing the urban heat island. If we look here, this is just Worcester examples, and this is research done by my team at Clark, the HERO program. We can see here where a patch of forest by Worcester State was replaced with a parking lot, and this leads to 11-degree increase in temperature, and this is over a 10-year period. Similarly, and much more common, we're seeing areas of forest in Massachusetts, again in Worcester, that are being replaced for housing or for new development. And while housing is incredibly important, it is also leading to this corresponding rise of tree temperature, this time 10 and 8.7 degrees respectively. So we're seeing this throughout the state. At the same time, it's really important to note that extreme heat is not just this urban problem that besets cities like Worcester or Leominster or Chelsea. It's also a problem for many rural communities. This is the town of Webster, which is just 12,000 people in southern central Massachusetts. This is what it looks like in terms of the satellite imagery. This is the heat. And then you can see there are a few environmental justice communities in Webster, and that they are the only ones that experience extreme heat. And so this is applicable for towns just like Webster that are not able to get funding through the Greening the Gateway Cities. It's also applicable in wealthy towns like Newton. So if you look at Newton here, you can see again the satellite imagery. You can see what the temperature looks like during an extreme heat wave. There's not really environmental justice groups in Newton, but there's one or two minority populations, or more than 40% non-white. But there is extreme levels of heat in these very dense suburban neighborhoods, even if they're very wealthy. And you can see the median household income here is very, very high. So this is one of the wealthiest places in the country, but it's still experiencing extreme heat. And so that is why very much in favor of this push to expand the Greening the Gateway Cities statewide. Right now, the Greening the Gateway Cities has planted over 34,000 trees. And again, it's important to note that they're planting them almost exclusively in these environmental justice communities, working with residents very closely, municipalities and nonprofits. It's being run by the EEA, but the DCR kind of enacts it, but it's all under that umbrella of Energy and Environmental Affairs. And in our analysis of it, we've seen very high success rate, both in terms of the trees, so above or around 91% survivorship, which is exemplary for a tree planting program, looking at national tree planting, and also an incredible increase of biodiversity. So there are 50 plus genuses with over 150 plus species being planted throughout these cities. They're not all native, but they are very diverse, and that will make the urban forest much more resilient in case of beetle outbreaks or diseases. So with that, I'm going to pass this off to someone from
it's just me.
So Celeste.
Hi, everybody. I'll keep this short so we have plenty of time for questions. But I wanted to let you know about some legislation that actually was just heard in the State House yesterday an act establishing the Municipal Reforestation Program, which sets up a structure to provide funding for participating municipalities throughout the Commonwealth to create a robust urban tree canopy cover in strategic locations, especially treeless neighborhoods. So this talk is actually the perfect setup to say why not just expand the Greening the Gateway Cities program. Main reason being this municipal reforestation program would be kind of an overall commitment to planting trees as a climate strategy and as a benefit to all the benefits we're just talked about here in terms of the trees. But it would set up a statewide council, and then all municipalities in the state that have under a certain percentage tree cover would come up with local plans, and the state would kind of be there to help fund and provide support, technical support, to increase the number of trees planted. So my next slide here, if you want to bop to the next one, also says you can still submit written testimony in support of this act. And I'm recommending before Friday at 5. It's not a formal deadline, but I'll be sending a follow-up email with more information on how to do that, because it's all relevant here. And at this point, I want to open it up for questions. You can either pop them in the chat or raise your hand, and we can call on you verbally as well for that very interesting talk.
Thank you.
I'm seeing in the chat, can you talk about the significance of choosing to plant trees on private property versus planting on city and state property? Why is this choice important?
Yeah, no, it's a great question, Marcos. So it makes, I think, a lot of the time when you're planting on state property, like on streets, which are some of the most available planting space in these, again, very urbanized areas with very little green space. Often the argument is that that's the only available place to plant. But what we're seeing is that the majority of actual plantable areas are on private property, even if it's in front of or in a very small front yard of a triple decker or in the backyard. These small green spaces comprise a lot more space. And usually the reason why people don't plant there is because they're not interested in engaging necessarily with the local residents in the same way. It takes a lot of time to talk to residents, to visit their house multiple times, to negotiate with them in order to earn their trust and then plant on their property. And in the same way, in a lot of these neighborhoods, there's a lot of renters. And so, again, it takes time to talk to the resident, talk to the landowner, and gain approval to plant trees there. And so those relationships, I think what's great and really exciting about the Greening the Gateway Cities program is that they've taken that time to do so in these neighborhoods that are historically underrepresented and haven't had the same kind of government attention. And so the fact that they've been able to be successful to plant as many trees as they have, as well as have those trees survive, which is really important, is a great kind of testament model that we could potentially see nationwide. And hopefully statewide. Yeah, Betty, I see you got a hand.
Sorry, yeah, that was very interesting. I have a whole bunch of questions. Two of them go together, which is having to do with funding and the ongoing nature of Greening the Gateway Cities and the possibility of blending that program together with the municipal reforestation program, which we would fondly hope to see enacted, but which has had funding problems. So I don't know if you want to comment on that at all. And
definitely.
Then after you do that, I had one more question, if it's okay.
Yeah. So in terms of this project and what I've looked at in this my dissertation did not specifically address kind of the return on investment necessarily of tree planting. I have done other work on that, modeling ecosystem services. And what we do see is that, even when the trees are very small, like the one planted in this image right here, they will start providing measurable cooling and energy savings and stormwater savings. In terms of when the benefits will actually cover the cost of tree planting, if we assume that each tree is about $600 total, including the cost of buying the tree, the people working and paying the salaries. So all of that makes each tree about $500, $600. We see the return on investment around like 12, 15 years, variable, depending on the type of tree. If it's a shade tree, if it's a ornamental tree, might take a little longer in terms of just those models. But that's just measuring 4 services. It's just looking at energy, stormwater runoff, air, and carbon sequestration. So as you can see with this diagram, there's many other benefits that come from planting trees that are harder to measure. The property value impacts are definitely significant, but again, hard to capture. And then, the benefits to biodiversity, the mental health benefits are potentially invaluable. So I understand the cost concerns, and I think the funding aspect needs to be looked at. I think that just on the tree side, they'll, if they survive and if the stewardship is there, they'll provide the benefits to the community that we invest in them. But in terms of the initial funding, that would be more. That'd be into the policy, mass state policy. Yeah.
Okay.
I hope that answers the question. Yeah.
Well, it was a different question, but it was interesting. So helpful. So you mentioned a few times sometimes native trees, and I wonder to what extent you were attempting to plant native species, because from a biodiversity point of view, it means a lot, whether it's a native tree or whether it isn't. But I also know that it's sometimes hard to find a native tree that works in a given environment. So
Definitely.
Can you talk about that a little?
So we didn't see any significant difference in terms of how native trees were doing compared to non-native trees. That being said, it is an urban environment. So we do see the stresses of being in an urban environment, lack of water, soil stress, salt, all the stresses that come with it mean that I'm not always, and foresters, I think, will say that native trees are not always the right tree for the right place. Sometimes a non-native tree is preferable and will do better and will provide some of these benefits, that maybe not the ecosystem ones, to the resident or to the community. That being said, I highlighted the biodiversity because in Worcester, 80% of our trees are Norway maples. So we all, almost the entire, or it used to be like, now it's around 60%, but almost the entire city of Worcester is one species of tree. And so just having 150 species of trees planted means that the city and the forest will be much more resilient to future pests. So in Worcester, there was a longhorn beetle that specifically targeted maple trees, and we lost 35,000 trees because there were all those species of this one beetle. So in that sense, it's great to see that there's so much variety being planted in this program.
But native is really different than non-native. And so I wondered to what extent you made an effort to plant native trees where you could.
So I'm just monitoring the program. I'm just studying what they're doing. But I will say the foresters, it's an interesting question, because if we look at all these benefits on this diagram by the Nature Conservancy for urban trees and for urban forests, only one of them really addresses native, that specifically is for native trees. So non-native trees reduce stress. They also increase property value. They manage stormwater. They provide cooling, and they filter the air as well. So there is the ecological benefit that they do not provide. Ginkgo trees are pretty much statues, like natural statues. I totally get that. And there's there's a great native plants community in Worcester that I'm trying to plant native stuff in my yard as well. But if we're thinking about trees, if we're reframing them as almost like green infrastructure, the native, non-native part matters less. And in urban areas in particular, where there's such a deficit in the just number of trees, I'm pretty pro just any tree that will survive being there.
Why on earth all those Norway maples? I mean, I have 2 of them in my yard too, so I get it.
Yeah,
Or 3 of them actually, but why? Do you know?
they're very
I
hardy
know
trees.
that one worked on, but why?
I completely agree. So I at Clark, actually, there is an arboretum that's over 100 years old, and there's 17 species of maples there. But the most prominent ones are these very old Norway maples. They're planted in rows as if along a street. And the person who ran it, Hadwin Obadiah, he was in charge of the Horticultural Society in Worcester, which is now Tower Hill Botanical Garden. And they might have recommended, based on what I'm looking at in terms of his arboretum, that you plant many Norway maples. In the 1950s, after Dutch elm disease, we saw a huge loss of American elms. So there was a big push to plant new trees, and they were replacing one species of tree. And so it looks like Norway maples were the choice, especially in Worcester and in the Northeast. Yeah, it's sad. We're trying not to repeat those mistakes. Yeah.
Good job.
Yeah, and I will say the nursery. So a lot of the decision of what type of tree to plant is dictated by 2 or 3 nurseries that are in the state of Massachusetts. So Bigelow is one, and I'm blanking on the other one, but it's further out. Amherst, I think it's near Amherst. And so availability often dictates what species of tree gets planted. And in the beginning of the Greening the Gateway Cities, they only planted about 20 species of tree because the nurseries didn't have the capacity to supply other tree species. So they would plant a lot of arborvitae and things like that. Now what we're seeing is, because the Greening the Gateway Cities has been around for so long, the state can really dictate what species of tree they want, which includes more natives, as well as a wider variety. Nancy. Oh, you're muted still.
A couple questions about the tree nurseries. Is EEA doing anything to expand tree nurseries and guaranteeing that they are growing more native species to make them available across the state?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think the EEA and the Greening the Gateway Cities is expanding and also kind of dictating what the nurseries are supplying now because of the amount of demand, right? 34,000 trees is a lot of trees that they're asking for. And if this act goes through, it'd be more trees. That being said, nurseries are primarily responding to resident demand. They're responding to the trees that are popular at Home Depot and at Lowe's. And if you go to the Home Depot and ask them which of these are native, no one's going to tell you anything. So in that respect, there's not, as far as I'm aware of, there's not plans for like a state-run nursery or anything like that. And as much I've seen about this bill, there's nothing in it that would be the state maintaining its own nursery.
Right.
A few cities did set up their own nurseries, which was interesting.
Yeah, but it seems to me that now is the time, if EEA is, coordinating tree planting for the climate. Part of their responsibility is public education, both to the nursery growers and the residents who are choosing trees, and why it's important to pick natives. And another question I have is partly a concern about what I saw. It looked like residents were choosing just 1 or 2 trees. And we know that really that the size of the tree canopy really matters. And if there was an attempt even to plant small groups of trees, 3, 4, 5, 6 trees together, it can have a much larger impact, which makes me wonder about new construction, say in Worcester. If they're building a new school or a new apartment building, are there any requirements for planting trees in groups that have at least a little bit of continuous tree cover? Or is that part of the individual town to create a tree ordinance that requires such a thing?
Yeah, you're getting at the answer there. It's definitely at the individual town level. And we are very behind, I would say, in designing tree policy. Like ordinances like that would make a huge difference. The Green the Gateway Cities program would try to plant as many trees as possible on a resident's property, depending on the space. But they also were worried about, planting too many that the resident couldn't take care of, and then those trees dying. So there's kind of a balance of,
Yeah.
how many, and then often what we did see a few times is if a resident took care of 2 or 3 trees, they would get like 7 more, because they would be like a more trusted partner in that sense. Which is great. But that being said, I would say there were plenty of yards that I was like, you could fit 5, 6 more trees here. But this is where we're getting into more aesthetics and use. If you want to have a space for your kids to run around, you don't want to just fill it with trees, your backyard. And so we'd see that a lot. There's a big movement for these like Japanese tree forests or small gardens. I'm going to butcher it, Miskowansky forests. There's one in Cambridge. There's going to be 2 in Worcester that are very dense pockets of forest with a variety of trees, shrubs, etc. that will be good for sequestering carbon and providing habitat. It'd be fun to see what that would look like on a residential property, I think. And we saw it in a few residents were really into that sort of thing, and they would be clearly trying to plant forests, whereas others were not. In terms of ordinances, there's nothing really that dictates, for new plantings, for new construction. And the primary, I think, reason why we see tree loss continuing is that, new development will just clear cut an entire property, and then, or if you're flipping a house, you'll clear cut the entire property, and then sell it with like 1 new tree in the front yard, that sort of thing. Marcos has a question, and then Betty. Does that work? Marcos says the question is, how does the scale or size of the Green the Gateway Cities program, 34,000 trees, not 130,000 trees, compared to the scale of the problem of tree loss? How does this make a significant dent in the problem, and how would you assess its effectiveness or success? So it's a great question, Marcos. I think in terms of, there's been, been involved with some research on this. Success looks different for different neighborhoods, but if we look in the historical record for especially these urban communities, we can see where there was tree canopy cover over time and create some sort of like maximum potential tree canopy cover. In a lot of the places that they're planting, that maximum number is maybe around 24%, 20%. So I think getting to even just those levels would make a big difference from the 10 or 15% they're at right now. Green the Gateway Cities says they're trying to get to 5% increase of what we have. And that they've decided is around 2,500 trees for these small planting zones. That's assuming no tree loss, no tree death, and that the majority of them are shade trees. And as we've seen, it's not always true. But I think the success, at least the high survivorship levels, in the rest of the country, 80% would be considered high, and we're in the 90s, is great. And then in terms of a significant dent, I think the Green the Gateway Cities is a model that the rest of the state could could take on. Like the Municipal Forestry Act is kind of the end goal of the Greening the Gateway Cities, some sort of sustained funding that, because Greening Gateway Cities keeps coming up for funding. It has to ask for it again and again, different governors, and they're only there on a 3-year basis. So there's not the kind of sustained engagement that is really necessary to see this 20, 30, 40, the lifetime of these trees. So, this Forestry Act is kind of the end goal for a more sustainable forest future. Yeah. Betty.
I wonder what your studies showed about how differently characterized EJ communities received the idea of planting trees and took care of them. Did you find differentials there that were significant? Were people really happy about this, or did you have to convince them?
Great question. So I will say the program is both a model for having success in these neighborhoods, but also I think at the individual resident level struggled often with language barriers, with cultural barriers, in order to make these breakthroughs. So there's definitely, I think we could have more papers on where there was success and where there was challenges. The places that saw the best kind of relationships and most enthusiasm was when the program partnered with a community organization that was really active and engaged in the community. So Leominster is kind of the best example of this. They, their official partner was this group that did farmers markets, growing places or growing spaces. I always mess up their name. But then they developed a relationship with the Spanish American Center, which was right in the heart of their planting zone, that really had a lot of, they primarily were working on, path to citizenship and English classes and those sort of things, and were a real pillar in the community. And they planted trees all over the center. And then anyone who went to the center got trees. They had events at the center for community members to talk to the foresters and learn about the tree planting program. And then the DCR actually moved their headquarters to right next to the Spanish American Center. So that's where I think we saw the biggest synergy. I would say the biggest pushback was Fall River, not necessarily from people of color, but there's a lot of I don't want to, but there's a large Portuguese population there with lots of grapevines, really well maintained property, very well maintained lawns. Did not want a large shade tree for legitimate reasons. And so there's definitely a big amount of pushback in terms of the trees there. But the community partner there was also not really, it was members that were not part of an environmental justice group. So there might have been multiple reasons why that didn't get through.
Thank you. Interesting.
Yeah, thank you so much, Professor Geron, for sticking around even a few minutes past here and answering all our questions. This has been really interesting.
I'm so excited to talk about this, people, and very happy to, especially Massachusetts residents and people active in this space. There's definitely a lot more that could be done here, both in terms of the policy side. The funding, I think, is a really interesting question moving forward. And then in terms of, how do you scale this operation? It's a very individual one-on-one relationships. So what does that look like across Massachusetts?